Let's touch grass and try to answer this question. Why do rulers care so much about religion? Now, hold your horses. I am going nowhere near 21st century politics because yikes. Please unclench. Instead, we're going to bring out our drills and mine the depths of Dar al-Islam during the post-classical era. First of all, the name Dar al-Islam loosely translates to the house where Islam lives, the abode of Islam, or anywhere that people practice Islam. It referred to lands under Muslim rule where Islamic law and institutions shaped society. This is super important because this changes how we look at Islam's role in the post-classical era. Today, many people think of religion as something deeply personal. In the post-classical world, religion was personal, but it was also public. It shaped laws, education, trade, government, and people's sense of belonging. It's hard for us to understand because instead of this, we have nationalism, or intense pride in our nation. That's what shapes our identities today. But back in the 1200s, political control and empires could easily change through conquest. So Dar al-Islam was a claim of identity through shared religion, which is part of why it was such a big deal to rulers. The spirit of Islam, the community of Islam, pulled a lot of weight. If you can convince people they're not just living in your empire, but they're part of a larger religious community, well, you've given them something bigger than a border to identify with. And that immediate sense of belonging is a fantastic tool for building authority, justifying power, and holding an empire together. So yeah, Dar al-Islam, kinda some important vocab there. You're gonna want to write that down. Now, let's see how 4 different Islamic states all answered the same question. How do you convince millions of people that you're supposed to be in charge? Well, here's how Islamic Spain answered that. They felt that faith was not just in prayer, but also in public responsibility. By keeping the quality of life high, they ensured that their citizens didn't want to revolt. Consider this. In Western Europe around the year 1000, streets were more like bumpy mud tracks. Human and food waste was thrown out of windows into those mud streets as well as alleyways, and the nights belonged to thieves and rats. Plague rats. But anyway, step into Cordoba, Spain under Muslim rule, and the scene changes entirely. They had sanitation workers, paved streets, oil lamp streetlights, steaming hot public baths with running water, and a library with hundreds of thousands of books. The people living in Islamic Spain were not just surviving like the rest of Western Europe. They outclassed them to an embarrassing degree. The rulers and scholars of Islamic Spain were constantly innovating ways to reassure its people that they deserved a life of comfort and dignity, which fed their spirits, bodies, and minds. Now, let's not get confused. The Golden Age of Islam was actually around the year, 900 to about 1000 CE-ish, which is before the AP World curriculum starts. By the year 1200, when AP students actually start to care and pay attention, Spain was undergoing an almost backwards transformation. Muslim rulers were losing Spain to Western Europeans and would eventually lose it all as Europeans reclaimed it in a not so cleverly named title of Reconquista, aka the reclaiming. So creative. Anyway, following the Christian conquest in 1236, all of those innovations we just heard about no longer maintained. The centrally planned sewer network remained partially functional for centuries, but the hundreds of public bathhouses were demolished or repurposed. By 1567, Philip II outright banned Arab bathing practices, causing a centuries-long decline in urban hygiene. So how does this tie into power and legitimacy? Well, consider this. If your quality of life is high, your kids are not dying of diseases, and your rulers basically just let you live your best life, and the only cost is a single extra tax called the jizya, well, it turns out that people are a lot less interested in overthrowing your government when your city has streetlights, hot baths, and fewer plague rats. I'm not saying that Christians and Jews loved paying extra taxes just for not being Muslim. Like, nobody has ever loved paying taxes. But it's amazing how much more tolerable taxes become when your city actually functions. Now, if we travel southeast from Spain to what we now know as Egypt, the Mamluks had a big problem. Imagine somebody suddenly announces, "Good news, everybody! Your new government is led by the slave soldiers." I'm sorry, the what? Yeah, the Mamluks had originally been purchased as enslaved boys, mostly from Central Asia and the territory between the Black and Caspian Seas. They were taken away from their families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to become elite cavalry warriors. The idea was actually pretty clever. Because they had no biological family ties or local loyalties, they were expected to be fiercely loyal to the sultan who raised them, as well as, their comrades. In exchange, the sultans had armies that were raised to view each other as family. Tiny problem. They got really good at the whole being soldiers thing. So good, in fact, that in 1250 they overthrew their rulers and put themselves in charge, which was probably not part of the original training program. Which creates a bit of an awkward political question. How do you convince millions of people that a bunch of former slave soldiers are supposed to rule one of the richest regions in the world? Well, step 1, engage epic hero mode. Up until this point, a major threat was rapidly taking over Asia, the Mongols. The Mongols had almost run out of places to conquer in Asia. Just a couple of spots were left. And the Mongols were trying to make their way into the Middle East and Europe. They even got into Baghdad, one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world, and then promptly destroyed it. However, the Mamluks faced down the Mongols in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut and won. It was incomprehensible. The Mongols had spent decades steamrolling kingdoms and empires across Eurasia. By 1260, most people probably assumed that if the Mongols showed up, losing to them was just what happened. Anyway, that victory against the boogeyman of the post-classical era completely changed the reputation of the Mamluks. They weren't just former slave soldiers anymore. They were the people who had stopped the seemingly unstoppable Mongols. But winning one battle, however impressive that battle was, isn't enough to establish a long-lasting government. Instead, the Mamluks used this victory to boost their credibility. With the budding trust of the citizens, the Mamluks began a campaign to win them over. The Mamluks actually built a huge reputation for standing against government and economic corruption. They poured money into building mosques and madrasas, sponsored religious scholars, protected the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and even invited a surviving member of the Abbasid family to Cairo to become the new caliph. Now, before you get excited, this new caliph did not actually run the government, so he was more of a symbol than anything else. But the fact that the Mamluks weren't threatened and were actually protective of him showed that they respected religion and tradition. The Mamluk Sultan had the army, and the caliph had the religious prestige. Put the two together, and suddenly those former slave soldiers didn't look like upstart revolutionaries anymore. They looked like the rightful defenders of Islam. So, how did the Mamluks convince Muslims, Christians, and Jews to accept their leadership? They rewrote the narrative. Instead of revolting slaves, they became the defenders of Islam. Now, the Delhi Sultanate was like, bro, you think that was hard? We wish we could just punch our problems away. If religion creates legitimacy, what happens when most of your subjects don't even share your religion? The overwhelming majority of the population in the Delhi Sultanate was Hindu, while the rulers were Muslim. This means that if the rulers walked into a room and announced, "Good news! We're all united by Islam," most of the room would have looked around and gone like, no? Now, the obvious answer would be to force your citizens to convert, and easy peasy. You are all now united under the same religion. Yay! Except that would be the wrong answer. It would make the citizens super bitter and sneak behind the government's back to practice their own beliefs and create instant rebellion. So instead, many Delhi sultans took a much more practical approach than forced conversions. Taxes! Yay! Said no one but the tax man. But seriously, the Hindus chose to pay the jizya tax just like Christians and Jews often did elsewhere in Dar al-Islam. Citizens were able to practice Hinduism, and many served in local government, helped run the empire in administrative positions, and even helped collect taxes themselves. There was still discrimination because, there's always discrimination when multiple cultures try to live together. But legally, there was protection and mandated tolerance. Now, one ruler that demonstrated that odd balance between legal tolerance and lived experience of discrimination was a sultan named Firuz Shah Tughlaq. Now, he came along and basically decided, you know what this empire needs? Less torture. Which, pretty low bar to clear, but hey, progress. He actually banned a whole list of punishments for breaking civil law that included things like amputations, gouging out eyes, burning people alive, pouring molten lead down people's throats. Yeah, medieval governments were enthusiastic. Anyway, Firuz Shah Tughlaq also built canals to improve irrigation. He worked hard to reduce famines, and he expanded public works through the empire. But unfortunately, history almost never gives us unproblematic heroes. Nobody is ever entirely good or entirely evil. The very same ruler who reduced torture for non-religious crimes also increased religious intolerance and discrimination towards Shia Muslims and Hindus. One of his least radical methods was to encourage conversion to Sunni Islam through tax exemptions and rewards, like literally giving mountains of presents kinds of rewards. Ironically, despite claiming to abolish burning as a civil punishment, sources from his reign also describe at least one execution by burning for religious crime. An elderly man, only known by the title Zunar Dar, was a well-respected, popular, devout Hindu that was accused of luring away Muslim women and having them convert into Hinduism. In his trial, he was given a choice: convert to Sunni Islam or die. He chose death and so was burned alive, feet first. So, was Firuz Shah Tughlaq tolerant? Was he intolerant? Also, It's an oversimplification to say that life was perfect and that the Delhi Sultanate was a great blend of Hindu and Muslim. But the rulers were still able to stay in power through being pragmatic. Rulers like Firuz Shah Tughlaq were able to stay in power because they legally compromised, even if privately they disagreed. So, big takeaway from the Delhi Sultanate, turns out it's a lot easier to govern millions of people if you don't spend every waking moment trying to fight all of them. Their empire wasn't held together because everyone believed the same thing. It held together because rulers learned that compromise usually lasts longer than coercion. Now, the smoothest sailing of the bunch was the Seljuks. Well, sort of. The Seljuks were Turkic peoples from Central Asia who conquered much of the Middle East, including Baghdad. But just because you conquer the capital doesn't automatically mean everyone thinks you're supposed to be in charge. So, what did they do? They broke an unspoken rule of conquest. They didn't get rid of the old government. Think about it. In almost every revolution and war, the first thing the new regime does is kill off, exile, or just generally get rid of the old regime. But the Seljuks didn't do that. Rather than get rid of the Abbasid Caliph, they took advantage of him instead. Think about it. Imagine buying a company and immediately firing the CEO that everybody knows and trusts and loves. Probably not a great first impression. So the Seljuks, realizing this concept, basically said, hey, you keep being the religious leader and we'll handle the government stuff. It was honestly a fantastic deal. The Abbasid Caliph kept his religious prestige, and the Seljuk Sultan got the political and military power. So everybody won. Well, mostly just the Seljuks. The Seljuks also continued to support mosques, madrasas, and Sunni scholars. They built on institutions that already existed under the Abbasids instead of, tearing everything down and starting over. But the Seljuks didn't just borrow the Abbasids' political legitimacy. They also borrowed something even harder to build from scratch: public trust. They kept investing in institutions that actually improved people's lives. One example was what is considered one of the first mental hospitals in the world. The story goes that a Seljuk princess, Nisibe, fell in love with a high-ranked warrior that worked at the palace. When her brother learned of this forbidden love, he sent the warrior off to the battlefields. The warrior returned severely wounded and, according to legend, died in Nisibe's arms. The trauma from all of this caused the princess to fall ill and eventually die. She left behind a will asking for the creation of a hospital to heal wounds of the sword and heart at no cost to the people who came for help. The Free Medical Center was established around 1205 or 1206 and continued to actively train healers until 1890 CE. The medical center used pharmaceutical treatments, physical treatments, and even music therapy. So, long story short, the Abbasids already had fairly advanced medical practices, some of which they had preserved from the ancient Greeks. The Seljuks didn't reject the legacy of the Abbasids, but instead accepted and even improved upon it. This wasn't just the case for medicine, but for all aspects of governance. So, how did the Seljuks answer our question? They inherited legitimacy instead of trying to invent it from scratch. They understood that people are much more willing to accept a new government when it still feels familiar. So, the Seljuks inherited the prestige of the Abbasid Caliph, borrowed its legitimacy, and then put their own spin on what it meant to rule. So, TLDR for Dar al-Islam. How do you build legitimacy as rulers? Islamic Spain built a society people wanted to live in. The Mamluks became regional heroes. The Delhi Sultanate used common sense about the kind of laws people would accept, and the Seljuks borrowed legitimacy from rulers the people already trusted. Now, on to today's AP tip for you. Today's AP tip for you might seem kind of backwards, but just trust me. In any free response question, DBQ, LEQ, SAQ, the prompt will never be to explain what a religion is. Instead, you will be asked what its impact was, or to what extent it did something. So when learning and studying, focus more energy on which empires used religion as fuel for warfare and conflict, and less energy on what the religion is. I have seen multiple essay questions on why Islam spread, but never on asking for a dissertation on why Muhammad was cool or how he established Islam. I mean, that can be used as historical context in your intro paragraph, but it would never be something you would have to write a full essay for on the AP test. So that's it for today. Romeo and I are going back inside. Peace!